Hi, this is Starkey Sowers. Welcome again to another Plus Program training series. Today's topic is macronutrients, carbohydrates, and this is part one. So you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, there's different types of nutrients. Indeed, there is. When we look at nutrients, there's a couple different types or different categories. First of all, there's what we call the macronutrients, and the macronutrients are proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. Second on the list are going to be micronutrients. So our focus is definitely going to be on macronutrients, and we're going to get into carbohydrates. But ultimately, when we look at macronutrients, they do a couple unique things. Number one, they provide us energy, specifically carbohydrates as well as fats and proteins. All provide energy. The other thing is proteins provide us what we call structural components, such as bones and muscles and tendons and ligaments and all the things that kind of make us who we are, as well as fats, and also proteins provide what we call regulatory concepts or regulatory pieces or parts for the body, such as hormones, neurotransmitters, as well as enzymes and things of that nature. So macronutrients have a lot of function, no question about it. And what we're going to do is we're kind of piece these things along. We're going to look at carbs, and then the next series we're going to look at fats, and then we're going to look at proteins as well too. All right, so let's specifically look at carbohydrates. A couple unique things about carbohydrates and all macronutrients. They're made out of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. The exceptions would be also with proteins, which also has nitrogen as well too. That would be the only exception. Fats are also carbons as well as hydrogens and oxygens. And when we look at the molecular structure, it's what we call C6. H12O6, so 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens as well. All right, so within that category, there are 3 different types of carbohydrates. They're what we call the simple carbohydrates or the sugars, as well as the complex carbohydrates or the long-chain starches or the long-chain carbohydrates, as well as fibers, which typically are known as non-digestible carbohydrates. And we're going to look at the complex carbohydrates and the non-digestible carbohydrates in part 2. So the emphasis and the focus, so to speak, of part 1 is going to be on the simple carbohydrates or the sugars. All right, so with that said, let's have a look at some simple carbohydrates. A couple things about simple carbohydrates. There's 2 classifications. There's what we call the monosaccharides or the single sugars. Those are typically made up of glucose, fructose, and galactose. Couple food examples would be fruit, all different types of fruits, and when it comes to different types of fruits and berries and things of that nature, we're going to have mostly simple carbohydrates. Most of those are going to be glucose and fructose. All right, honey has a little bit of glucose and fructose as well. And so then when we look at the disaccharides, those are actually 2 sugar molecules that are stuck together. And those disaccharides specifically are going to be things like lactose. Lactose, of course, only comes from milk sugars. Doesn't come from any type of milk substitute. It's just going to be a type of milk sugar, whether it's going to be goat's milk or whether it's going to be cow's milk or something of that nature. All right, so we also see what we call sucrose, and sucrose comes specifically from beets as well as from cane sugars as well. And so when we see sucrose, that's our common table sugar that we have a tendency to see almost added to every type of food on the planet oftentimes. And we're going to talk a little bit about the overconsumption of sucrose as well later on. So the final one also would be maltose, and maltose is typically what we're going to find in barley malt or different types of grain malts and things of that nature. And you might be thinking, I don't know if I've ever had any type of malt. Well, next time you go to a particular type of maybe a fast food restaurant for a treat, mind you, that's for a treat, and they have an option for a shake or a malt, ask them for a malt, and that malt flavor is kind of unique. It has a definite kind of a grainy flavor to it, kind of a sweet sense that's maybe you've never ever tried before. All right. So with that said, it kind of gives us a little foundation about carbohydrates. Remember, we're on sugars, so those are going to be the monos as well as the disaccharides. So what I want to do is I want to kind of delve into a couple different things. When we look at sugars, there's some unique things about sugars that have really kind of brought sugars into like what we call the focus or the view. One of the biggest things about sugars is this. Remember that the body runs or uses glucose on a regular basis. In fact, the brain uses for its energy source roughly about 90% glucose. It uses a little bit of fatty acids and some amino acids, but it prefers glucose. Mind you, if you don't consume sugars, the body will also make it out of other different types of substances, including fats as well as proteins. All right. So with that said, what's the big beef with sugars? Well, a couple different things. Number one, the average person eats on a regular basis about 20 teaspoons of added sugars a day. That's a lot of sugar, no question about it. In fact, literally like 100 or 200 years ago, the average consumption was like 1 teaspoon a day. So we have literally just gone 20 times more than what we originally were like 200 years ago. That's a lot of sugar. So what does that equate to? Roughly about 130 pounds per person a year in sugar. That is a lot of sugar. So what's happened is the government has not only seen a correlation to specific types of diseases or disorders in the body, but what it's also done is actually kind of redefined what we call the nutritional facts panel to help people maybe understand a little bit more about sugars. So the new panels that are going to be coming out in the next couple months and years, we're actually going to see on there a category that actually shows added sugars. And the government has actually established what they call an upper threshold or a total daily amount of added sugars that they would recommend that you would only consume a day. And they've actually defined that as roughly about 50 grams a day. So when you look at 50 grams, that's literally half of what we're consuming on the average now. So what's the big problem with sugars? A couple of unique things. Obviously, dental cavities or cavities in general are directly correlated to sugar consumption, but there's also a lot of other different types of diseases now we know are related to overconsumption of simple sugars. Those include things such as diabetes, obesity, as well as heart disease. And so the big focus that we're going to tell you is this. What you want to do is simplify your life a little bit. Start reading some panels and start looking at the labels. If there's added sugars in there, it doesn't matter whether they're organic, doesn't matter whether they're whole sugar, whatever the case might be, added sugars, period, are too much in the day, oftentimes with so many people, so you want to focus in on what's on the label. A couple pieces of fruit a day throughout the day help with bolstering like energy for the brain. Absolutely perfect. Want to do that, no question about it, but watch the added sugars in the label. Definitely stay in tune for part 2 because we're going to talk about complex carbohydrates and fibers on that next segment. This is Starkey Sowers. Thanks again for watching another Plus Program training series.